David Harris stood calmly in line at the airport, his boarding pass neatly folded in his hand. The Chicago skyline was in his near future, a city where business awaited him. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing out of the ordinary for someone in his position. But airports never felt simple to David. As the line inched forward through the security checkpoint, David could feel the familiar weight of scrutiny. Eyes flicked toward him, then back down. He was accustomed to it by now, the way people measured him, evaluated him, but never really saw him. He wasn't just a man standing in line like everyone else. He was a successful African-American business owner, the CEO of one of the fastest-growing private airlines in the country. Yet all they saw was his skin, and with it came assumptions. David passed through the security scanner, his bag in hand. Everything should have been routine, but then he saw him, a white police officer stationed by the check-in counter, his eyes lingering on David just a moment too long. The look was familiar, almost routine itself by now. Suspicion, judgment, and something deeper that David had long since learned to detect, prejudice. He could sense it in the officer's stare, the way his eyes followed David's every movement. It wasn't an overt challenge, not yet, but it was enough to unsettle him. David straightened his posture, keeping his face calm and unreadable. Years of practice had taught him how to manage these moments. He could already feel the tension rising inside, but outwardly, he remained composed. There was no reason for alarm, he told himself. He was simply another passenger on his own airline's flight. Except, of course, that wasn't quite true. He moved toward the boarding gate, feeling the officer's gaze burn into his back. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed what he already knew. The officer hadn't looked away. He was still watching, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. David's heart beat faster, though his face betrayed no sign of discomfort. This had happened before, too many times, and each time he had managed to walk away without a scene. But something felt different today. The moment David reached the gate, he heard footsteps behind him, fast and deliberate. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Sir!" came the sharp voice from behind him. David stopped, exhaled softly, and turned to face the officer, Officer John Mitchell, whose hand was already hovering near his holstered radio. He wasn't smiling. "Let me see your documents," Mitchell ordered, his voice laced with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. David raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his passport and boarding pass with slow, deliberate movements. Without a word, he handed them to the officer, his calm facade unshaken. Around them, passengers began to notice the interaction. A few people cast curious glances, and David could feel the ripple of attention starting to build. The unease of being singled out, the weight of eyes on him, and the assumption that he had done something wrong hung in the air. He had felt this before. This was the moment when things could spiral out of control. Mitchell took the documents without looking at David directly, flipping them open with a quick snap. His expression grew more intense as he scanned the passport, his brows furrowing. David remained silent, though his irritation was starting to build. "Where are you flying to?" Mitchell asked, still fixated on the papers, his tone sharp. "To Chicago," David replied calmly. "For what purpose?" Mitchell asked, his voice growing colder. "Business," David answered. Mitchell closed the passport but didn't return it immediately. He hesitated for a second longer than necessary, his eyes scanning David as though trying to piece something together, trying to make sense of a puzzle that wasn't there. David knew exactly what was going through the officer's mind, the disbelief that someone who looked like him could be more than just another passenger. Without warning, Mitchell reached out and grabbed David's arm, his grip firm but not aggressive. The action was unnecessary, but it was meant to assert control. David could have resisted, could have pulled back and demanded an explanation, but he knew better. Resistance would only escalate the situation. Mitchell led David toward his car parked just outside the terminal. The crowd around them parted, curious eyes following their every move. David kept his head high, his steps steady, knowing that this was the moment the officer's confidence would begin to waver. Inside the police car, David sat in the back seat, watching as Officer Mitchell settled into the driver's seat, his eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror to check on David's reaction. The officer's face was still expressionless, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a small crack in his ironclad demeanor. David leaned forward slightly, catching the officer's gaze in the mirror. "Do you know who I am?" David asked calmly. Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, clearly expecting some ridiculous claim or excuse. "I'm the owner of this airline," David said softly, the calm in his voice almost unsettling. The smirk disappeared from Mitchell's face in an instant. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted back to David in the rearview mirror, wide with disbelief. He hadn't expected that. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the air in the car growing heavier with each passing second. It took only a moment for the officer's confidence to begin crumbling. David could see the realization dawning in Mitchell's eyes, that he had made a serious mistake. The officer's hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, his knuckles turning white. David remained silent, watching the officer's reaction unfold like a slow-motion collapse. It was only the beginning, but David knew he had already won the first battle. As the police car sped through the airport grounds, the air inside the vehicle was thick with tension. Officer John Mitchell sat in the driver's seat, his eyes locked on the road, but David could sense the unease radiating from him. Mitchell had made a mistake that could cost him more than just his pride. David could see the cracks beginning to form in the officer's self-assurance. David leaned back, still calm, but the weight of the situation pressed on his mind. He had faced prejudice before, but something about this day felt different. Today he wasn't powerless. Today he held a card that Officer Mitchell hadn't anticipated. Mitchell's silence was telling. His earlier arrogance had disappeared, replaced by a subtle tension. David glanced out the window, watching the city move past, knowing that each passing moment brought the officer closer to facing the consequences of his actions. The police station loomed ahead, gray and imposing, a symbol of authority that had been weaponized against people like David for generations. But this time, things would be different. David had the resources, the platform, and the power to fight back. As they pulled into the parking lot, David's phone vibrated in his pocket. A quick glance showed a message from his lawyer, Lisa Turner. "On my way, don't say a word." David felt a surge of reassurance. He wasn't alone in this fight. The door clicked open, and Officer Mitchell motioned for David to step out. David complied, stepping out of the car and walking alongside Mitchell, his every movement calm and deliberate. Inside the station, the sterile fluorescent lights reflected off the dull white walls, casting a harsh glow over everything. The moment they entered, the gazes of other officers followed them. Suspicion, curiosity, and judgment flitted through the room. David could feel their eyes on him, reading him like a problem that needed solving. He had seen these looks before, the ones that reduced him to nothing more than a suspect in their eyes. Mitchell remained silent, leading David into a small room near the back of the station. It was cramped, with only a single metal table and 2 chairs, but it felt like the room had been designed to strip away any sense of dignity. David took a seat, folding his hands on the table in front of him, his posture composed. Mitchell stood by the door, filling out paperwork, his movements mechanical but hurried. David watched him closely, noting the subtle signs of nervousness, the way the officer's hands trembled as he wrote, the quick glances at the clock, the shift in his posture that betrayed his growing uncertainty. David's phone buzzed again. Another message from Lisa. 5 minutes out. The minutes dragged by as the tension in the room thickened. Mitchell continued to avoid eye contact, focusing on his paperwork as if it held the answers to his unraveling confidence. David sat quietly, letting the silence speak for itself. "How much longer?" David asked, his voice steady. Mitchell glanced up but said nothing. His silence was loud. It was the kind of silence that told David everything he needed to know. The officer was waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to come and fix the mess he had created. David didn't push. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over them both. He had been through situations like this before, but today was different. Today, he had leverage. "My lawyer is on her way," David said after a beat, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. The officer froze, his pen hovering over the paperwork. For a moment, David saw a flash of fear in Mitchell's eyes. It was brief, but it was there, an acknowledgement that the situation was no longer in his control. David watched as Mitchell's composure began to slip further. The officer's hands shook as he continued filling out forms, his focus now entirely on the ticking clock. The authority he had wielded so confidently was starting to crumble, and David could see it happening in real time. It wasn't long before the door opened and Lisa Turner stepped inside. Her presence was immediate, calm, professional, and in control. She nodded to David before turning her sharp gaze to Officer Mitchell. "Good afternoon, officer," Lisa said, her voice polite but with a clear undercurrent of firmness. "I trust my client hasn't been mistreated?" Mitchell, visibly flustered, cleared his throat. "I'm just following protocol," he mumbled, avoiding Lisa's gaze. Lisa raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "I'd like to speak with my client now." Mitchell hesitated, but Lisa's presence left no room for debate. He stepped out of the room, leaving David and Lisa alone. Lisa wasted no time. She pulled out her tablet, quickly reviewing the situation with David. Her expression was focused, her mind clearly racing through the legal angles. "This is classic profiling, David," she said, her voice calm but edged with frustration. "They had no reason to detain you." David nodded. "I didn't resist. I knew it would only make things worse." "You did the right thing," Lisa said, her eyes meeting his. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. This isn't just about today. This is about every time they've gotten away with it." David felt a sense of relief wash over him. He trusted Lisa. She had been his lawyer for years, and she knew how to navigate cases like this. But this time, it wasn't just about winning. It was about making a point. Outside the room, the low hum of the police station continued, officers going about their day as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But for David, this day was anything but ordinary. It was a turning point. Lisa stood up, gathering her things. "Let's go. We're leaving." David followed her lead, standing tall as they walked out of the room and into the main lobby of the station. As they passed by the officers, David could feel their eyes on him again. But this time, the judgment felt different, tinged with unease, uncertainty. They had no idea who they had just tangled with. Outside, the sunlight hit David's face, and for the first time that day, he felt a wave of calm. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning he was ready for. As Lisa led him to her car, she turned to him with a small smile. "We're going to make sure they regret this." David nodded, his own resolve hardening. He knew this fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The day of the trial dawned bright, but there was an undeniable tension in the air as David stood in front of the courthouse. The imposing stone steps seemed to stretch into the sky, and the heavy wooden doors, once intimidating, now signaled the entrance to a battlefield. Today wasn't just about his personal confrontation with Officer Mitchell. This trial was bigger. It was about shining a light on systemic issues that had gone unchecked for far too long. Lisa Turner walked beside him, her usual confident stride even more determined today. She had meticulously prepared every argument, knowing that this trial could set a precedent. David felt reassured by her presence, though the weight of the situation pressed on him. Inside, he was calm, but he knew that today was about more than just clearing his name. The courtroom was packed, with reporters and spectators filling the seats. The case had drawn national attention, and David could feel the eyes of the public on him. The tension was palpable as they entered, the low murmur of voices quieting as the clock ticked closer to the start of proceedings. In the front row, Officer John Mitchell sat with his legal team, his face pale, his once confident demeanor now overshadowed by the weight of the charges. David took his seat at the plaintiff's table, his gaze meeting Mitchell's for a brief moment. The officer quickly looked away, his jaw clenched. David knew that Mitchell had never expected to be in this position. He had never anticipated that his actions would lead to this kind of fallout. The gavel struck, and Judge Samuel Brooks entered the courtroom. He was known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, and his reputation as a fair but firm judge preceded him. David felt a wave of reassurance as Judge Brooks took his seat. The trial began. Lisa Turner stood up, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her voice was calm but powerful as she began her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about an individual act of misconduct. This case is about a pattern of racial profiling and systemic bias that has been allowed to persist unchecked. My client, David Harris, was unlawfully detained and humiliated, not because of his actions, but because of his appearance. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. Officer John Mitchell saw a successful African-American man and, without reason, decided that he was a threat. This is not an isolated incident. This is a symptom of a larger issue within our society. The jury listened intently, their expression somber. Lisa continued, her voice unwavering. David Harris is not just a passenger on a flight. He is the owner of the airline, and yet he was treated as if he were a criminal. Today, we are here to hold those responsible accountable, to send a message that this kind of behavior will no longer be tolerated. As Lisa concluded her opening statement, David felt a surge of gratitude for her. She had captured the essence of the trial, not just as a legal battle, but as a fight for justice on a much larger scale. The defense attorney for Officer Mitchell, a man named Richard Walsh, stood up next. His posture was stiff, and his tone was defensive as he began speaking. Your Honor, members of the jury, my client, Officer Mitchell, was simply following protocol. He acted in the interest of public safety, and he did not act out of malice or prejudice. In today's world, law enforcement officers face difficult decisions every day, and my client was doing his duty. Walsh continued, trying to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate consequence of heightened security concerns. But David could tell from the body language of the jury that they weren't convinced. The defense's argument lacked the substance and clarity that Lisa's had brought to the table. When Officer Mitchell was called to the stand, his once steady voice faltered. His legal team had prepared him well, but it was clear that he was struggling under the pressure. He tried to justify his actions, claiming that he had acted within the law, but his words sounded hollow. The jury could see the cracks in his story, and so could David. The emotional crescendo of the trial came when David was called to testify. As he walked to the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. He took a deep breath, his hands steady as he prepared to share his experience with the world. Lisa stood beside him, ready to guide him through his testimony. Mr. Harris, Lisa began, can you tell us about the day you were detained by Officer Mitchell? David's voice was calm but resolute as he recounted the events of that day. I was traveling to Chicago on business. I passed through airport security like any other passenger, but I noticed Officer Mitchell watching me. His gaze lingered on me longer than on anyone else, and I could feel that something was wrong. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I showed him my documents. I answered his questions. But it didn't matter. He had already decided that I was a threat, not because of anything I did, but because of how I looked. David glanced toward the jury, making eye contact with them. I've dealt with this kind of prejudice my entire life, but what made this different was that I wasn't powerless. I'm the owner of the airline, and Officer Mitchell didn't know that. He didn't see a businessman. He saw a stereotype. The jury was rapt, their attention fully on David as he continued. When Officer Mitchell detained me, he didn't just detain a passenger. He detained the owner of the airline. His actions were based on a bias that has no place in law enforcement. David's testimony hit hard. He spoke not just of his personal experience, but of the larger systemic issues at play. The courtroom was still as his words resonated with everyone present. As the trial continued, Lisa built her case with precision. She called witnesses, presented evidence, and dismantled the defense's arguments piece by piece. The tension in the courtroom grew as the jury began to see the full scope of the injustice that had occurred. When it was time for closing arguments, Lisa stood before the jury one last time. Several days after the verdict, David received a call from his lawyer. I thought you'd like to know, Lisa said. Mitchell's packing up his things at the station. He's done. David was quiet for a moment, processing the news. He didn't see this coming, he finally said. No, Lisa agreed. He didn't. A part of David wanted to go to the police station, to see Mitchell one last time, not out of vindictiveness, but for closure. He wanted to see the man who had once held so much power over him, now brought low by his own actions. David arrived at the station later that afternoon. He stood at a distance, watching as Mitchell, with his shoulders slumped, packed his belongings into a cardboard box. The officer looked broken, his face lined with exhaustion and regret. The man who had once looked at David with disdain and arrogance now looked like a shell of his former self. David didn't approach him. He didn't need to. This was closure enough. As the weeks passed, David's life began to settle into a new normal. He returned to his business, continuing to manage his airline and its growing success. But there was something different now. Every time he looked in the mirror, he was reminded of the fight he had just won, and of the battles that were still to come. David sat in his office, his desk cluttered with reports and paperwork. But his attention wasn't on the numbers or the daily operations of his company. Instead, he found himself thinking about the larger picture, about how his case had become a turning point, not just for him, but for others like him who had been wronged by a system designed to protect the powerful. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lisa. "You've been invited to speak at a human rights conference," she said, handing him the invitation. "They want you to share your story." David looked at the invitation, the official letterhead, and the formal language. But all he could think about was the responsibility that came with it. This wasn't just about his story. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for so long. "I'll do it," he said after a moment. "It's time we started talking about this." A few weeks later, David found himself standing at a podium in front of a large crowd. Journalists, activists, and politicians filled the room, all waiting to hear from the man who had become a symbol of change. David took a deep breath, scanning the faces in the audience. This wasn't like speaking in a boardroom or negotiating a business deal. This was something different, something more personal. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "My name is David Harris, and I stand before you not just as a businessman, but as a man who has experienced the deep-rooted injustices of our system." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "My story is not unique. It's not the first time someone has been targeted because of their race, and it won't be the last. But what makes this moment different is that we are finally starting to acknowledge the problem. We are finally starting to demand change." David's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the passion behind his words clear. This is not just about holding one officer accountable. It's about holding a system accountable. A system that has allowed prejudice and bias to thrive for too long. We need to rethink how we treat each other, how we train those in power, and how we demand justice for all. The audience erupted into applause, but David wasn't done yet. "This is only the beginning. We can't let this moment pass without action. We have the power to change things, to create a system that truly protects and serves everyone, regardless of the color of their skin." As David stepped down from the podium, he felt a surge of emotion. This was more than just his victory. It was a step toward something bigger, a movement for change that was long overdue. In the weeks following the conference, David began to see the first signs of real change. Reports started to emerge that other police departments across the country were reassessing their policies, introducing new training programs focused on racial bias and de-escalation tactics. David watched with a sense of hope as cities began to implement reforms, and discussions about police accountability became more prominent in political circles. Politicians were introducing bills that aimed to address systemic bias in law enforcement, and there were calls for stricter oversight of police practices. On one evening, David sat in his living room, watching the news. A segment came on about a major city police department that had begun retraining its officers to address racial profiling. They showed footage of officers in classrooms, learning about the impact of bias and the importance of treating every individual with respect. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. David leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The fight was far from over, but they were making progress. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. In this act, we see the immediate fallout from the trial and its impact on both David and the wider system. Officer Mitchell's downfall serves as a moment of closure for David, but the real victory comes in the form of systemic changes that begin to take place across the country. David's role as a voice for justice grows, and he becomes an advocate for broader societal reform. The emotional rhythm drops after the high of the courtroom drama, but the progress toward lasting change adds depth and meaning to the narrative. In the months following the trial, David Harris's life changed in ways he had never anticipated. What had started as a confrontation with Officer John Mitchell had now become a national movement. His story was no longer just a personal victory. It was a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. David found himself inundated with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and appearances. News outlets wanted his perspective, activists sought his support, and communities across the country looked to him as a leader in the growing movement for police reform. Sitting in his office one morning, David scrolled through his emails. Offers to speak at universities, conferences, and rallies flooded his inbox. There was one message, however, that stood out. It was from a senator in Washington, D.C., inviting David to testify before Congress on the issue of racial profiling and police accountability. Lisa Turner had always told David that his case could set a precedent, but he had never imagined it would take him this far. The opportunity to speak before Congress wasn't just a chance to tell his story, it was a chance to push for real legislative change. David leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of the decision. He had won the battle in court, but this was something much larger. This was the chance to influence policy and leave a lasting impact on the country. The day arrived for David to testify, and the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. was electric. His case had gained so much attention that the hearing was packed with journalists, politicians, and advocates for change. As David walked into the hearing room, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced the same injustice. Senator Monica Hughes, a staunch advocate for police reform, opened the hearing. We are here today to address the systemic issues in law enforcement that have led to countless cases of racial profiling, excessive force, and injustice. Mr. Harris, your story has become a symbol of the change we need in this country. Please share with us your experience. David cleared his throat, his voice calm but powerful as he began to recount the events that had led him to this moment. He spoke not just of the day Officer Mitchell detained him, but of the larger issues at play, how racial bias had followed him throughout his life, how it was embedded in the system, and how it was time to dismantle it. This isn't just about one officer, David said, looking at the members of Congress. It's about a system that has allowed people like him to act without consequence. We need laws that hold law enforcement accountable, that protect citizens from being unfairly targeted, and that ensure justice is served for everyone, regardless of their race. The room was silent as David finished speaking. His words had struck a chord, not just with the politicians in the room, but with the nation watching on television. For the first time, it felt like real change was possible. In the weeks following David's testimony, the momentum for change continued to grow. Senator Hughes, along with several other lawmakers, introduced a bill aimed at addressing racial profiling and increasing police accountability. The proposed legislation included measures for de-escalation training, independent oversight of police departments, and harsher penalties for officers who engaged in discriminatory practices. David watched as the bill gained support from politicians on both sides of the aisle. It wasn't easy. There were detractors who resisted change, who argued that the system didn't need reform, but David knew that this was a fight worth having. Lisa Turner, always by his side, helped him navigate the complex world of politics. Together, they met with senators, attended press conferences, and pushed for the bill's passage. The emotional rhythm of the story reached a new crescendo, as David realized that his fight was no longer just a personal one. It had become a fight for the soul of the country. As the bill moved through Congress, David's story continued to inspire people across the country. Cities that had once resisted change were now implementing reforms. Police departments began adopting new policies, focusing on community policing and bias training. Officers were held to higher standards, and cases of misconduct were investigated with greater scrutiny. David watched these changes unfold with a sense of pride and satisfaction. His victory in court had sparked something much larger, a movement that was reshaping the very fabric of law enforcement in America. The emotional highs and lows of the past year began to settle into a steady rhythm as real progress was made. David had become a symbol of hope, not just for those who had been wronged by the system, but for everyone who believed in a fairer, more just society. One day, as David sat in his office, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from Officer John Mitchell. David hesitated before opening it. He hadn't thought much about Mitchell since the trial, other than knowing that the officer had lost his job and faded from the public eye. But now, holding the letter in his hand, David felt a surge of curiosity. The letter was brief, but its words carried a weight that surprised David. Mr. Harris, I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to write to you because I've had a lot of time to reflect on what happened. I made a mistake, one that cost me everything. I let my biases guide my actions, and I failed to see you for who you are, not for what I assumed you to be. I know there's no excuse for what I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Sincerely, John Mitchell. David read the letter twice, then a third time. It wasn't a full reconciliation. He doubted Mitchell would ever fully understand the depth of the harm he had caused, but it was something. It was a small step toward accountability, and that mattered. David didn't respond to the letter. He wasn't ready, and maybe he never would be. But knowing that Mitchell had finally come to terms with his actions gave David a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. Months later, the bill that David had fought so hard for was passed into law. It wasn't perfect. No piece of legislation ever was. But it was a monumental step toward creating a more just and equitable system. David stood on the steps of the Capitol, looking out at the crowd of supporters who had gathered to celebrate the victory. It was a surreal moment, one that felt like both an ending and a beginning. As he stood there, Lisa Turner by his side, David realized how far he had come. He had started this journey as just another man trying to get on a plane, but now he was something more. A voice for change, a symbol of resilience, and a beacon of hope for others. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more battles to fight. But for the first time, David felt like the world was moving in the right direction. "We did it," Lisa said, smiling at him. David nodded. "Yeah, we did." As the sun set behind the Capitol, David knew that this was only the beginning of the next chapter. There was still work to be done, but today, they had taken a giant step forward. In this final act, David's story reaches its emotional and societal climax as he becomes a key figure in the national fight for police reform. The passage of the Reform Bill is the culmination of his journey, and the nationwide impact of his story reflects the broader changes taking place. Officer Mitchell's apology adds a layer of personal closure to David's arc, while the bill's passage marks a major victory for the movement. David's role as a symbol of change is solidified, and the story ends on a note of hope and determination for the future. The emotional rhythm of the story, rising to crescendos, dropping, and then reaching even higher peaks, mirrors the personal and societal transformation that David and the country undergo together. This completes the full narrative, bringing the story to a satisfying and impactful conclusion. As David stood in front of the Capitol, the crowd still buzzing with excitement over the passage of the Reform Bill, he felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a responsibility to keep pushing forward. The journey for justice was far from over, and he knew that the story needed to continue. A camera crew approached, ready to capture his final thoughts for a video segment that would be broadcast to a larger audience online. David stepped in front of the camera, his voice steady as he prepared to deliver one final message. "This victory today is a step in the right direction," David said, looking directly into the lens. "But it's just one of many steps we need to take. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without all of us working together." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "If this story has inspired you, if you believe in the fight for justice, I invite you to join me on this journey. Together we can push for the changes that our society needs." David offered a small, hopeful smile as he prepared for the final call to action. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about fighting for what's right. Your support makes a difference, and together, we can continue to shine a light on the issues that matter. Thank you for standing with us. With that, the camera crew signaled that the recording was over. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift. The fight would continue, but now he wasn't alone. The community he had helped build, both online and offline, was ready to stand with him. As David walked away from the Capitol steps, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world was changing, and he was ready to keep pushing forward one step at a time.